The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, 6 men stared at the same frequency display, watching the transponder signal fade in and out like a dying heartbeat. Captain Marcus Reeves pressed 2 fingers against his temple, eyes fixed on the digital map where a single aircraft icon blinked alone over the Korangal Valley. The A-10 Thunderbolt had been circling for 17 minutes. No communication, no distress call. Just the rhythmic pulse of her transponder and the knowledge that somewhere below, pinned against a ridgeline by enemy fire, 12 Navy SEALs were counting seconds. The officer beside Reeves cleared his throat. "Sir, we need to recall her. Protocol states." Reeves raised one hand, cutting him off. His jaw tightened as he watched that solitary blip make another slow orbit. He knew who was up there. Everyone in the tactical operations community knew the call sign Widow. What they didn't know, what the sanitized personnel files would never reveal, was why Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Kane had chosen that particular identifier 7 years ago, or why she flew every close air support mission like it was both penance and prayer. The mountains below held their secrets close. Jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush stretched endlessly, their shadows deep enough to hide entire armies. The SEAL team had gone dark 43 minutes ago, their last transmission fragmented and desperate. Contact, heavy, coordinates barely readable through the interference. Standard procedure demanded multiple aircraft, coordinated strikes, backup contingencies. What they had instead was one pilot, one aircraft, and a fuel gauge that showed 18 minutes of loiter time remaining. Reeves had seen the mission roster that morning. He'd recognized the name and felt that familiar twist in his gut, the one that came from knowing too much history. Adrian Kane wasn't supposed to be flying today. She'd pulled a double shift covering for a pilot with food poisoning, her 3rd consecutive day in the cockpit. The flight surgeon had cleared her barely, and now she was alone over some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan, maintaining radio silence for reasons no one in the operations center could comprehend. The youngest analyst spoke up, his voice uncertain. Could be equipment failure, radio malfunction. No one responded, they all knew better. The A-10's redundant communication systems didn't fail simultaneously. Whatever was happening up there, it was intentional. Reeves checked his watch, then the fuel calculations on his screen. In approximately 11 minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Kane would reach bingo fuel, the point of no return. She would have to break off, climb to altitude, and begin her flight back to base, leaving those 12 men to whatever waited in the rocks below. He reached for his headset, then hesitated. Sometimes the only thing worse than silence was breaking it. The altimeter read 8,000 feet. Major Adrian Kane kept her breathing steady, eyes scanning the ridgeline below through the A-10's HUD. Her left hand rested light on the throttle, right hand steady on the stick, both moving with the kind of unconscious precision that came from 4,000 hours in the cockpit. The Warthog, as every A-10 pilot called their aircraft, responded to the slightest input, banking gently as she adjusted her orbit. The twin General Electric turbofan engines hummed their familiar song, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Below, somewhere in that maze of rocks and sparse vegetation, 12 men were fighting for their lives. She'd spotted the muzzle flashes 6 minutes ago, counted the positions, cataloged the enemy firing points with the methodical attention that had earned her a reputation for surgical precision. 9 confirmed hostiles, probably more hidden in the caves. The SEALs were pinned in a depression between 2 ridges, caught in a perfect kill zone with nowhere to run. She could see the tactical problem with crystalline clarity. Any conventional gun run would require her to approach from the east, following the valley floor, exposing herself to whatever air defense systems the enemy had positioned in the high ground. The A-10 was built to take punishment. Titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit, redundant systems, ability to fly with half a wing missing, but built tough didn't mean invincible, and a dead pilot couldn't save anyone. Adrian toggled through her weapons display. 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 1,100 rounds remaining. 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles. Full complement of rockets. Enough ordnance to level a small city, but firepower meant nothing without the geometry to use it. She pulled the aircraft into a steeper bank, analyzing angles, calculating approach vectors in her head while her hands flew through pre-combat checks. Fuel, 17 minutes. Time since last enemy transmission, 44 minutes. Probability those men were still alive, decreasing with each passing second. Her finger hovered over the radio transmit button. Standard procedure demanded she request clearance, coordinate with ground controllers, establish communication with the pinned unit. Standard procedure assumed you had backup, assumed you had time, assumed the rulebook accounted for every possible scenario. Adrian had stopped believing in assumptions the day she'd watched an MC-130 burn on a runway in Kandahar, taking her husband and 37 other souls with it. The call sign Widow hadn't been her choice initially. It had started as mess hall gossip, the kind of casual cruelty military culture sometimes permits. But she'd claimed it, owned it, turned it into something else entirely. If they wanted to remember her as the pilot who'd lost everything, fine. She'd make sure they also remembered her as the one who never left anyone behind. She nosed the Warthog down slightly, losing altitude, and began her calculations. The enemy positions were spread across the northern ridge in a textbook defensive arrangement. Adrian marked each one mentally, heavy machine gun emplacement at the highest point, providing overwatch. 3 fighting positions lower down, creating interlocking fields of fire. The remaining hostiles would be mobile, moving between covered positions, making themselves hard to target. Smart tactics. Disciplined. Not the usual Taliban fighters who relied on volume of fire over precision. She'd seen enough combat in 12 years to recognize professional soldiers when she encountered them. Below, partially hidden behind a jumble of boulders, she caught movement, the briefest flash of a tan uniform. The SEALs, still alive, still fighting. She watched as one of them popped up just long enough to fire a 3-round burst, then disappeared again. Disciplined fire control, conserving ammunition. They knew help was coming. They just didn't know it was a single aircraft orbiting above them, a pilot working out a geometric puzzle that would determine whether they lived or died. Adrian ran through the scenario again, visualizing each second of the approach. Standard doctrine called for a gun run from the east, straight up the valley, weapons hot, pray the titanium held. But standard doctrine would get her killed and leave 12 men stranded. The northern approach was impossible. She'd be flying directly into enemy fire with no room to maneuver. South meant exposing the SEALs to her own ordnance. West required threading a needle between 2 peaks with maybe 30 feet of clearance on either side. In an F-16 maybe. In an A-10 with its 47-foot wingspan and the maneuverability of a freight train, it was borderline suicidal. She checked fuel again. 16 minutes. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Sometimes the only way out was through. She keyed her internal recorder, not the radio, just the cockpit voice recorder that would document her final decisions if this went wrong. Her voice came out steady, professional, almost detached. Widow initiating close air support run. Multiple hostiles, eastern ridge. Friendlies marked by IR strobe depression between ridges, approaching from west, low altitude, no backup, no clearance. She paused, then added words that weren't in any manual. For Danny. For all of them. Her husband's name, spoken aloud for the first time in 7 years while strapped into a cockpit. The A-10 rolled smoothly as she pushed the stick left, beginning her descent. The mountains rose up to meet her, ancient and indifferent. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, flipping switches, adjusting trim, preparing the aircraft for what came next. At Bagram, the operations center descended into controlled chaos. Lieutenant Hayes, the communications officer, stood abruptly from his console, headset pressed tight against his ear. "Sir, I'm picking up something on the backup frequency. Internal recorder transmission, not directed comms. She's going in." Reeves was across the floor in 3 strides. "Play it." The words crackled through the speakers, Adrian's voice calm and measured as she described her approach vector. When she mentioned no backup, no clearance, one of the senior officers swore quietly. But it was the final phrase for Danny, for all of them. that made Reeves close his eyes briefly. He'd known Danny Kane. They'd flown C-130s together before Danny transferred to Special Operations. Good pilot, better man, the kind of officer who remembered every crew chief's birthday. The crash had been mechanical failure, a freak hydraulic malfunction that sent the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin during takeoff. The investigation cleared everyone involved. Sometimes machines just failed. Sometimes good people died for no reason at all. What Reeves hadn't known until this moment was how deeply Adrian carried that loss, how completely it had reshaped her into the pilot who now dove toward a valley floor with the kind of calculated recklessness that looked like courage but might have been something more complicated. Hayes pulled up the trajectory data, projecting her flight path across the main display. The room went silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. "She's coming in through the Western Gap," someone whispered. "That's impossible." But the data didn't lie. The A-10 was descending rapidly, her airspeed increasing as she committed to an approach that existed in the narrow space between tactically brilliant and completely insane. Reeves grabbed the radio, knowing even as he did that it was futile. "Widow, Bagram Actual, abort your approach. Repeat, abort and climb to safe altitude. Static." He tried again, putting command weight behind the words. "Lieutenant Colonel Kane, acknowledge transmission." Nothing. She wasn't ignoring orders. Her radio was deliberately switched off. This was her mission now, her choice, her responsibility. The weight of command settled over Reeves like a familiar coat. He could scramble additional aircraft, but they'd arrive 20 minutes too late. He could formally order a recall, but she wouldn't hear it. He could document every breach of protocol, but that assumed she'd survive to face consequences. What he couldn't do was change the simple mathematics of the situation. 12 men would die without close air support, and Adrian Kane was the only pilot in position to provide it. The mountains blurred past on either side, close enough that Adrian could see individual rocks, patches of snow, the weathered striations in ancient stone. She'd threaded the needle between the two peaks, the A-10's wingtips clearing the rock faces by margins measured in feet rather than yards. Her altitude was 4,000 feet and dropping, airspeed 220 knots, the aircraft's nose pitched down at an angle that would have violated every regulation in the book if anyone had been watching. But no one was watching. This was the thing they never told you about combat. The moments that mattered most often happened in complete solitude. All the training, all the briefings, all the careful planning collapsed down to a single person making split-second decisions while wrapped in 15 tons of titanium and thrust. The Western Gap fell behind her. Ahead, the valley opened up, and she had perhaps 4 seconds to acquire targets, align her approach, and commit to the gun run before the geometry fell apart. Her targeting system painted the ridgeline in synthetic green, marking heat signatures and probable hostile positions. She toggled to manual targeting. Computers were helpful, but her eyes were better. First pass would be the machine gun emplacement. Take out the overwatch position, blind the enemy's command and control. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was already spun up, waiting for her finger on the trigger. 70 rounds per second of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The A-10 had been built around this gun, designed from the ground up to be a flying weapons platform that could shred tanks and reduce fortified positions to rubble. She'd seen what it could do to human beings. The images never left you. At 3,000 feet, she pickled off the first Maverick missile. The AGM-65 dropped away from the wing pylon, its rocket motor igniting as the seeker head locked onto the heat signature of the machine gun position. She didn't wait to observe impact. Her hands were already moving, bringing the nose around, walking the gun sight toward her second target. The A-10 shuddered as she pulled into a bank that stressed the airframe to its limits. G-forces pressed her into the ejection seat, the anti-G suit inflating around her legs and abdomen to keep blood from pooling. She'd trained for this, spent hundreds of hours in the simulator learning exactly how hard she could push the aircraft before something broke. Theory met practice at 2,000 feet. The Maverick struck the ridgeline with the force of a small earthquake. Adrian registered the explosion in her peripheral vision orange flash, expanding cloud of rock dust and debris, but her focus stayed locked on the targeting reticle. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life, and the entire aircraft seemed to pause mid-flight as the cannon fired. This was the A-10's defining characteristic. The recoil from the gun was strong enough to slow the airplane in flight, a testament to the sheer destructive power housed in the nose of the aircraft. Tracer rounds drew a burning line through the air, each one marking every fifth round in the stream. The remaining 80% were invisible until impact. She watched them walk across the second fighting position, 30mm rounds pulverizing rock and flesh with equal indifference. 2 seconds of sustained fire, 40 rounds downrange. The position ceased to exist. Banking hard right, she brought the aircraft around for the next target. Her breathing stayed controlled, mechanical in through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm she'd learned from a flight instructor who'd flown A-1 Skyraiders in Vietnam. Old tactics for old aircraft. The A-10 was a relic itself, a Cold War dinosaur that had somehow remained relevant through 40 years of changing warfare. But in close air support, in the ugly work of supporting troops in contact, nothing else came close. The third fighting position was trying to relocate, enemy fighters scrambling from cover to cover. She gave them credit for recognizing the threat, but recognition didn't equal survival. She walked the gun across their movement path, leading the target the way a hunter leads a deer. The physics were simple. Aircraft moving at 200 knots, targets moving at maybe 10 miles per hour, bullet travel time creating a geometric offset that existed in the space between intention and impact. The A-10 bucked and shuddered with each trigger pull, its crude reliability somehow reassuring. This wasn't a precision instrument. It was a hammer, and she wielded it with the skill of someone who'd learned to turn brutality into artistry. The altimeter unwound through 1,500 feet. She was below the ridgeline now, flying in the valley floor proper, rocks and sparse vegetation visible in stark detail through the canopy. Any anti-aircraft system with a competent operator would have a clear shot. She waited for the warning tones that would indicate a missile lock, the audio alert that meant someone had targeted her aircraft. Silence. Either they didn't have air defense, or they'd already learned that shooting at an A-10 often just made it angry. The fourth pass took her directly over the SEAL position. She caught a glimpse of faces turned skyward, men who'd spent the last hour convinced they were going to die now watching an ungainly aircraft tear apart the enemy positions with methodical precision. One of them raised a fist in salute. She didn't acknowledge it, couldn't afford to break concentration, but something in her chest tightened anyway. This was why she flew, not for the medals or the promotion boards or the after-action reports. For the moment when desperate men realized they weren't alone, that someone had come for them, that today wasn't their day to die. The remaining enemy fighters had gone to ground, hiding in the network of caves and crevices that made the Hindu Kush so brutally difficult to secure. She could spend the rest of her ammunition chasing shadows, or she could make one more pass that would send a message impossible to misinterpret. Adrian pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn, gaining altitude while keeping the ridgeline in sight. Fuel read 9 minutes. Not enough to loiter, barely enough to get back to base if she climbed to altitude immediately and flew a direct course. The smart play was to break off, let the SEALs extract while the enemy stayed suppressed, call it a win and go home. But smart plays assumed you were trying to survive. Her eyes found the cave system on the northern slope, dark openings in the rock face where the remaining hostiles had retreated. Standard tactics said you didn't waste ordnance on empty caves. Standard tactics assumed you followed the playbook. She armed her second Maverick missile, designated the largest cave opening, and fired. The missile streaked downrange, its contrail a white line against the brown hillside. Impact came 2 seconds later, the warhead penetrating deep before detonating, the overpressure wave turning the cave system into a tomb. Rock face collapsed inward, avalanche of stone sealing the openings. Anyone inside wouldn't be threatening anyone ever again. The A-10 climbed away from the valley floor, engine straining as she pulled maximum power. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. Weapons safe, systems check, fuel management. The familiar routine of post-combat procedures, muscle memory taking over while her mind processed what had just happened. She'd engaged multiple targets without backup, without clearance, without even confirming the rules of engagement. She'd violated at least a dozen protocols and probably ended her career in the process. Worth it. Every time, worth it. Bagram Operations Center erupted in subdued celebration, the kind of controlled enthusiasm military professionals displayed when something impossible had just succeeded. Hayes had patched through the SEAL team frequency, and their transmission crackled over the speakers. Targets neutralized, all personnel accounted for, requesting immediate extract. Reeves listened to the relief in their voices, the slight tremor that came from men who'd been staring at mortality and found themselves unexpectedly granted a reprieve. On the main display, Adrian's aircraft icon climbed steadily, her flight path a textbook returned course to base. But the fuel calculations on his screen told a different story. Lieutenant Marsh, the logistics officer, spoke quietly beside him. "Sir, she's not going to make it back. Not at that altitude, not with her current fuel state." Reeves ran the numbers himself, hoping Marsh had miscalculated. He hadn't. Adrian had maybe 6 minutes of fuel remaining, and even if she dove for maximum efficiency, Bagram was still 11 minutes away. The A-10 could glide. Its straight-wing design gave it decent lift-to-drag ratios compared to fighters, but gliding meant picking a landing site, and this part of Afghanistan offered few good options for putting down 15 tons of aircraft. He opened the channel to the tower. "Bagram Tower, Ops. I need every available asset airborne for a possible search and rescue. Also get me a fuel bird, fastest thing we have." "Copy that, Ops. What's our timeline?" Reeves looked at the fuel projection, watching it count down with mechanical certainty. "Figure 8 minutes before we have a pilot on the ground. Maybe less." The words felt inadequate, a sterile military description of what would actually happen when Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Kane ran out of fuel somewhere over the most hostile terrain in Central Asia. The tower controller's voice came back, professional despite the urgency. "Tanker is spinning up now. KC-135, call sign Texaco 23. They're estimating wheels up in 4 minutes. 4 minutes to launch. Then flight time to intercept. Then the delicate ballet of matching speeds and positions while a probe and drogue system transferred fuel mid-flight. Under perfect conditions, with a cooperative receiver and unlimited time, it was challenging. Under combat conditions, with a fuel-critical aircraft and a pilot who'd just flown the mission of a lifetime, it bordered on impossible. But the alternative was unacceptable. Reeves grabbed his headset and keyed the emergency frequency, the one Adrian couldn't ignore even with her radios deliberately switched down. "Widow, Bagram actual on guard. We have a tanker launching. Maintain current heading, climb to Angels 15. Acknowledge." The emergency frequency crackled to life in Adrian's headset, breaking through the deliberate isolation she'd maintained for the past 20 minutes. Reeves' voice, calm but underlaid with urgency, giving her instructions she'd already calculated were mathematically unlikely to succeed. She glanced at the fuel gauge. 4 minutes remaining, maybe 5 if she leaned the mixture to the point where the engines were barely sipping fuel. The math was simple and unforgiving. But Reeves was trying, and that meant something. She toggled the radio. "Bagram actual, widow. Copy your last. Climbing to Angels 15. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, steady, professional, betraying none of the fatigue that pressed against her shoulders or the adrenaline crash that was beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. The A-10's nose pitched up as she established the climb, trading airspeed for altitude. The aircraft responded sluggishly, heavy with combat fatigue, every system strained by the mission she'd just flown. She ran through her gauges, hydraulics nominal, electrical systems good, engines running smooth despite the abuse she'd put them through. The Warthog had earned its reputation for toughness. Now she needed it to give her just a little more. 15,000 feet. The air thinned, temperature dropping, the cockpit heating system struggling to keep pace. Below, Afghanistan spread out in shades of brown and gray, beautiful in its harsh desolation. She'd flown over this country for 12 years, watched seasons change from the cockpit of various aircraft, memorized the contours of valleys and the shapes of villages. It had taken Danny from her. It had given her purpose in return, though she'd never quite decided if that was a fair trade. The fuel gauge flickered, needle dropping into the red zone. 3 minutes. Her radio crackled again. Widow Texaco 23, we're airborne and tracking your position. Estimate intercept in 6 mics. How's your fuel state? 6 minutes. She needed 3. The mathematics of survival had never been her strongest subject. Texaco, Widow, I'm glad you're coming, but I don't think the numbers work. Copy that, Widow, but you stay airborne anyway. I've seen A-10 pilots do impossible things before. The tanker pilot's voice carried a hint of humor, the kind of gallows wit that kept military personnel sane in insane situations. Adrian found herself smiling despite everything. Texaco, I'll do my best. Widow out. The engines coughed. Not dramatically, just a brief hesitation, a momentary stumble in their steady roar. Adrian's hands moved immediately to the fuel management panel, switching tanks, adjusting flow rates, doing everything she'd been trained to do to squeeze every last drop of usable fuel from a system that was already running on fumes. The A-10 had internal fuel tanks in the wings and fuselage, plus provisions for external tanks on the wing pylons. She'd burned through the externals' first standard procedure, and now the internals were showing vapor. Physics dictated what happened next, and physics didn't negotiate. Another cough, longer this time. The right engine's exhaust temperature spiked briefly, then settled. The General Electric TF-34 turbofans were reliable engines, but reliability meant nothing without fuel. She could feel the moment approaching, the inevitable transition from powered flight to powerless glide. Her altitude was 14,800 feet. Below, the terrain had shifted from mountains to rolling hills, slightly less hostile but still offering minimal landing options. In theory, the A-10 could land on rough fields. It had been designed for forward operating bases with minimal infrastructure. In practice, putting down a damaged aircraft with no power on uncertain terrain was a controlled crash at best. The radio traffic increased as multiple aircraft converged on her position. The tanker calling out intercept calculations. A rescue helicopter launching from Bagram, already acknowledging they'd be too late if the worst happened. An F-16 flight diverting from a patrol route, offering to escort her down. The full resources of the United States military mobilizing around one pilot in one aircraft, because that's what they did. No one left behind. She thought about Danny, wondered what he'd say if he could see her now. Probably something about her terrible decision-making skills, delivered with that crooked smile that had first caught her attention at flight school. He'd always been the cautious one, the pilot who followed checklists and procedures, who believed the rules were written in blood and therefore sacred. She'd been the opposite, intuitive, willing to push boundaries, convinced that regulations were guidelines rather than commandments. Somehow they'd balanced each other, made each other better. Until the MC-130 augured in and balance became a memory. The left engine coughed, coughed again. She checked the gauge. Fuel remaining, effectively 0. The silence was profound. For the first time in 12 years of flying, Adrian experienced what military pilots called the quiet, that moment when engines stopped and the aircraft became a glider, subject to gravity and aerodynamics with no thrust to bargain between them. The A-10 maintained its altitude, momentum carrying it forward, but she could feel the subtle deceleration, the way the controls felt slightly mushier without engine response. She had time. Not much, but some. The aircraft's glide ratio was roughly 8-to-1 under optimal conditions, meaning she could cover 8 miles of horizontal distance for every mile of altitude lost. 14,000 feet meant roughly 20 miles of glide, maybe a bit more if she managed energy perfectly. The tanker was 4 minutes out. 4 minutes equaled roughly 40 miles at the KC-135's cruise speed. The mathematics remained stubbornly unforgiving. She keyed the radio, keeping her voice level. Texaco 23 Widow. I've lost both engines. Currently in a glide approximately 14,000 feet heading 270. I'm going to need you to be creative. Widow Texaco, copy your status. Stand by. In the background, she could hear hurried conversation as the tanker crew worked through options. The KC-135 was a big aircraft, based on the Boeing 707 airframe, designed to fly steady and level while receiver aircraft plugged into its fuel boom. What it wasn't designed for was high-speed descents or extreme maneuvering, but crews had been doing impossible things since the dawn of military aviation. Widow Texaco, here's what we're going to try. I'm going to come down to meet you. We're going to attempt to hook up in a shallow descent. You'll need to maintain at least 160 knots for control authority. Can you do that? Adrian ran the calculations in her head. Maintaining 160 knots meant steeper descent angle, less total glide time. But without engines, she needed the tanker's fuel boom to reach her rather than trying to climb to meet it. Texaco Widow, I can maintain 160, but I'm going to be descending through whatever altitude you're at. This is going to be tight. Copy that, Widow. We've done tight before. The confidence in the tanker pilot's voice steadied her. Someone else believed this was possible, which meant it wasn't pure fantasy. She adjusted her flight path, pointing the nose at a spot in space where the tanker should be in approximately 3 minutes. The A-10 descended steadily, silent except for the whistle of wind across the fuselage. At 8,000 feet, she spotted the tanker. The KC-135 was descending rapidly, its profile unmistakable even at a distance-long fuselage, swept wings, that distinctive T-tail configuration. Seeing it felt like a small miracle, though Adrian knew miracles were usually just preparation meeting opportunity. She trained for aerial refueling hundreds of times, knew the procedures cold, approach from behind and below, match the tanker's airspeed and altitude, guide the probe into the drogue basket, maintain formation while fuel transferred. Standard procedure assumed powered flight, gentle closure rates, multiple attempts possible. What she was about to attempt had probably never been done before and definitely wasn't in any manual. Widow Texaco, I have you visual 7 o'clock low. Extending the boom now. Rate of descent is 800 feet per minute. Call when you're ready for hookup. Texaco Widow, I see you. Beginning approach. The A-10 was a stable glider, its straight wings and relatively low wing loading providing decent handling characteristics. But gliders couldn't easily add energy. Once you bled off airspeed or altitude, getting it back required trading one for the other. She'd get exactly one chance at this. The tanker grew larger in her windscreen. She could see the boom extending from the rear fuselage, the operator's station where someone was watching her approach through cameras and periscope. That operator would be talking to the pilot, calling out distances and closure rates, managing this aerial ballet with the precision it required. Adrian made minute adjustments with the stick, fine-tuning her flight path. The A-10's refueling receptacle was located on the nose, forward of the cockpit. She needed to position it directly below the boom's nozzle, then maintain that exact position while the boom extended and locked into place. In powered flight, her engines could make the constant adjustments. In a glide, she had gravity, momentum, and skill. Distance closed, 500 feet, 400, 300. She could see the boom operator's window now, a small blister on the tanker's belly where a human being watched her approach with whatever mixture of professional calm and appropriate terror the situation warranted. 200 feet. Her airspeed was 165 knots, just above minimum. The A-10 wanted to slow down, to settle into a more comfortable glide speed, but she held the nose down, trading precious altitude for the speed she needed. 100 feet. The boom moved, the operator making adjustments based on her position. Adrian matched the movement, flying formation with a precision that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit. 50 feet separated the two aircraft. In commercial aviation, that would be terrifyingly close. In military aviation, it was just another Tuesday, albeit a Tuesday that involved descending through 6,000 feet with no engines while trying to thread a needle in 3 dimensions. Widow, you're looking good. Closure rate nominal, prepare for contact. She made a final adjustment, placing the refueling receptacle directly in the boom's path. The tanker operator extended the boom with practiced precision. She felt the thump as it made contact, heard the mechanical lock engage. For one perfect moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Then the boom disconnected. Contact and disconnect. Widow, stand by for second attempt. Adrian felt the A-10 slip slightly, the disruption in airflow from the boom contact enough to upset the delicate equilibrium of her glide. She corrected immediately, but the correction cost her speed. Airspeed dropped to 158 knots, below the minimum she needed for control authority. Texaco, I'm losing airspeed. Need you to accelerate slightly or I'm going to fall out of formation. Widow, negative. I'm already at my maximum descent speed. If I go faster, I'll exceed structural limits for boom extension. You need to push the nose down, gain that speed back. Push the nose down. Trade altitude for airspeed. Simple physics. But her altimeter read 5,000 feet, and every foot she lost was one she wouldn't get back. She'd be gliding over terrain that offered exactly 0 good landing sites, and if this didn't work on the next attempt, she'd be making decisions about whether to eject over hostile territory or try to dead-stick the aircraft into whatever flat spot she could find. Neither option appealed. Adrian pushed the nose down. The A-10 accelerated, airspeed climbing back through 160 knots, but her descent rate increased to match. She was falling out of the sky slightly faster now, buying seconds of formation time at the cost of hundreds of feet of altitude. Second attempt, prepare for contact. The boom extended again, and this time Adrian was ready for the airflow disruption. She anticipated the slight pitch-up tendency, corrected before it developed, held position as the boom's nozzle found the receptacle and locked home. The mechanical indicators in her cockpit showed green. Fuel flow active. The first drops of fuel hit the A-10's tanks, and Adrian felt something unclench in her chest. Not relief. The situation was still critical, but the knowledge that she just bought herself options. The fuel flow indicator showed 400 pounds per minute transferring from the tanker to her aircraft. At that rate, she'd have enough to restart her engines in approximately 2 minutes, maybe less. But those were going to be the longest 2 minutes of her life. The tanker pilot's voice came through, steady and professional. Widow, Texaco, fuel transfer in progress. Estimate you'll hit minimum restart quantity in 90 seconds. How's your formation? Texaco, Widow, formation stable. Altitude passing through 4,000 feet. 4,000 feet. In the mountains of Afghanistan, that was barely above some of the peaks. They were descending into the foothills now, terrain that would kill her just as efficiently as the high peaks if she had to put down. The boom vibrated slightly as the two aircraft bounced in light turbulence. Adrian made constant tiny corrections, keeping the refueling receptacle aligned with the boom's nozzle. Any significant deviation would break the connection, and she didn't have altitude remaining for multiple reconnection attempts. In her peripheral vision, she tracked the fuel gauge. The needle began to rise, crawling up from empty with agonizing slowness. Military aircraft fuel systems were designed with redundancy and safety in mind, which meant they incorporated various sumps and separation tanks to prevent fuel starvation. She needed enough fuel in the system to ensure the engines would restart reliably, without stuttering or flaming out due to vapor in the fuel lines. The altimeter unwound through 3,500 feet. Below, she could see scattered villages, terraced agricultural fields, the geometric patterns humans imposed on landscape when they tried to make hostile terrain livable. People down there were probably looking up, seeing a large aircraft descending with a smaller one attached beneath it, wondering what emergency had brought American military aircraft so low over their homes. Widow, you're at minimum restart quantity. Recommend you attempt restart now while we still have altitude to work with. Adrian's hand moved to the engine start switches. Standard procedure was to restart one engine at a time, verify it was running stable, then start the second. But standard procedure assumed she had comfortable margins of altitude and time. She had neither. She initiated both engine starts simultaneously, watching the turbine RPM gauges as the starter motors spun the turbofans up to speed. The fuel system fed JP-8 into the combustion chambers. Igniters fired, creating the initial flame. For a moment, a terrible, stretched-out moment, nothing happened. Then the left engine caught. The familiar rumble transmitted through the airframe, gauges showing normal temperature and pressure. The right engine hesitated, RPMs climbing but combustion not yet established. Adrian watched the exhaust temperature gauge spike again. A hot start, potentially damaging but infinitely preferable to no start at all. The right engine roared to life. She had power again. Real power, not the theoretical promise of fuel but actual thrust pushing her forward. She advanced the throttles slightly, feeling the A-10 respond, the nose wanting to pitch up as thrust overcame drag. Texaco Widow. Both engines restarted and running nominal. Request we maintain contact for another minute to top off tanks. Copy that, Widow. We've got time. Fuel flow continuing. The tanker pilot's voice carried audible relief. They'd pulled off something unprecedented, an aerial refueling during an unpowered glide that would probably become a case study in flight school someday. But for now, it was just two crews doing their jobs with the skill and professionalism that kept military aviation functional. Adrian watched the fuel gauge climb toward full. Each additional pound of fuel was insurance against the next crisis, the next emergency, the next impossible situation. When the gauge showed 3/4 full, she made the call. Texaco, Widow, breaking contact. Thanks for the gas and the story. Anytime, Widow, glad we could help. Safe flight home. The boom disconnected cleanly. Adrian pulled back slightly on the stick, climbing away from the tanker's turbulence. The A-10 responded eagerly, happy to be back in powered flight, to be doing what it was designed for rather than approximating a glider. She watched the KC-135 continue its descent, leveling out at a lower altitude before beginning its own climb back to operational height. Someone on that crew had just earned a medal and probably a phone call from someone important. They deserve both. Her radio crackled with multiple transmissions, Bagram operations requesting status, the rescue helicopter standing down, the F-16 flight acknowledging they were RTB. The full apparatus of concern that had mobilized around her emergency was now winding down, satisfied that Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Kane would make it back to base alive. Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. Adrian had climbed to 10,000 feet, run through post-emergency checklists, verified all systems were functioning within normal parameters. The A-10 had taken the abuse she'd inflicted and kept flying, which was exactly what the aircraft was built to do. On approach, she contacted the tower and received immediate clearance. Aircraft in emergency status got priority, even when the emergency was technically resolved. She configured for landing. Gear down, flaps extended, airspeed bleeding off as she crossed the threshold. The main gear kissed the runway with barely a chirp. Touchdown speed was 120 knots, fast by civilian standards but normal for a combat aircraft. She deployed the thrust reversers, feeling the deceleration press her against the harness. The A-10 slowed, docile now, just another airplane at the end of another mission. The tower directed her to parking area Delta, where a small crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast on military bases, especially when someone had just survived something they probably shouldn't have. She taxied the aircraft into position, shut down the engines, and began the post-flight procedures with methodical attention. Each switch thrown, each system secured, the ritual of transitioning from flight to ground operations. When she finally popped the canopy and unstrapped, the afternoon air hit her like a wall. Hot, dry, thick with dust and jet fuel smell. Afghanistan in all its glory. The crew chief who met her at the bottom of the ladder was young, maybe 22, with sergeant stripes and an expression that mixed awe with confusion. "Ma'am, they're saying you flew the entire mission solo. No wingman, no backup, and then glided for 5 minutes to hook up with a tanker. That true?" Adrian pulled off her helmet, ran a hand through sweat-dampened hair. "More or less, Sergeant. How's the jet look? He glanced back at the A-10, his professional eye cataloging the battle damage and wear. She's got some dings, ma'am, nothing that won't buff out. Whoever built this thing knew what they were doing. Fairchild Republic back when aircraft were allowed to be ugly if they were effective. She patted the nose landing gear. She brought me home, that's what matters. Captain Reeves approached across the tarmac, his expression unreadable in that way senior officers cultivated when they needed to have difficult conversations. Adrian straightened, sudden awareness that the reckoning for her decisions was about to begin. Reeves stopped 3 feet away, close enough for conversation but maintaining the physical distance that rank and situation required. His eyes scanned her face, looking for signs of shock or injury, the automatic assessment of a commander responsible for personnel welfare. "Colonel Kane, hell of a mission." "Sir." She kept her voice neutral, waiting to see which direction this conversation would go. He could court-martial her for a dozen different violations. He could also put her in for a medal. Military justice was flexible that way. The SEAL team is requesting you by name. They want to buy you a beer and probably propose marriage, all 12 of them. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Your refueling with Texaco 23 is already legend. The boom operator said he's never seen formation flying like that and he's been doing this for 15 years. Just trying to stay alive, sir. You saved 12 men today, Adrian. The use of her first name was deliberate, a momentary setting aside of rank. You also violated approximately every regulation we have regarding solo operations, close air support protocols, and fuel management. I'm going to have to write this up. She'd expected nothing less. Understood, sir. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write the most detailed after-action report of your career. You're going to document every decision, every factor that led you to fly that mission the way you did. You're going to make it so bulletproof that when the review board reads it, they'll understand why everything you did while technically against regulations was the only correct course of action. Reeves paused, his expression softening slightly. And then I'm going to recommend you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, because what you did today is exactly the kind of exceptional airmanship that award was created to recognize. The words hit harder than she'd expected. Recognition for flying had never been the point she flew because it was the only thing that made sense anymore, the only place where the chaos of loss transformed into the clarity of purpose. But hearing someone acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, breaking the rules had been the right choice meant something. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. The review board might still decide to ground you pending investigation, but I'll fight that if I have to. We need pilots like you. He glanced at the A-10, then back to her. Get some rest. Medical checkout in 2 hours, then debrief tomorrow at 0800. Dismissed. The debriefing room at Bagram was exactly like every military debriefing room Adrian had ever occupied. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill, a long table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs, walls covered in maps and classified material warnings. She sat at one end, her after-action report stacked neatly in front of her. Across the table, 5 officers represented various aspects of Air Force oversight operations: safety, legal, intelligence, and maintenance. They'd been grilling her for 90 minutes, working through every decision point of the mission with forensic attention. Major Elizabeth Cortez, the safety officer, leaned forward. "Colonel Kane, walk me through your decision to maintain radio silence during the approach. Standard procedure requires continuous communication with ground controllers." Adrian had known this question was coming. She'd rehearsed the answer, trying to find words that would convey tactical necessity without sounding like excuses. "Ma'am, my assessment was that radio communication would provide no tactical advantage and might compromise mission effectiveness. Ground control couldn't see the target area with sufficient detail to provide guidance. My situational awareness from altitude was superior to anything they could relay. Communication would have been a distraction. That's not procedure." "No, ma'am, it's not. But procedure assumes optimal conditions. I was facing a time-critical situation with friendlies in immediate danger." Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, representing legal, made a note on his tablet. His expression gave away nothing, but Adrian knew he was cataloging potential violations. In the military justice system, good intentions weren't always sufficient defense. The intelligence officer, a captain whose name tape read Harrison, spoke up. Your report indicates you identified 9 hostile combatants, but post-mission reconnaissance only confirmed 6 bodies. Can you account for the discrepancy? I engaged all visible targets. The cave system collapse may have trapped additional hostiles, or they may have withdrawn during the engagement. My priority was suppressing threats to friendly forces, not confirming body counts. Harrison nodded, making his own notes. The kill count mattered for intelligence purposes, understanding enemy force disposition, identifying patterns, building a picture of insurgent capabilities. But in the moment when you were pulling the trigger, numbers became abstractions. You shot at threats until they stopped being threats. That was the calculus of combat. Colonel Vance, the senior operations officer, had been silent through most of the debriefing. Now he set down his tablet and fixed Adrian with a look that suggested he'd seen every pilot trick and excuse over a 30-year career. Colonel Kane, I want to address something that's not in your report. You lost your husband 7 years ago in a C-130 crash. You've been flying combat missions almost continuously since then, accumulating more flight hours than pilots 10 years your senior. Your call sign references that loss. I need to understand, is your decision-making impaired by survivor's guilt or a death wish? The question hung in the air, brutal in its directness. Around the table, the other officers shifted uncomfortably. This was the unspoken concern that probably everyone had thought but no one wanted to voice. Adrian met Vance's eyes without flinching. Sir, with respect, that's a psychological question better suited to a flight surgeon than a combat debrief. But I'll answer it. I don't have a death wish. If I did, I wouldn't have fought so hard to stay alive when my engines flamed out. What I have is a clear understanding that some missions require accepting risk that looks suicidal to outside observers. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Danny died because a hydraulic line failed at the worst possible moment. Mechanical failure, pure chance. I can't prevent random mechanical failures. But I can prevent American personnel from dying when I have the capability to help them. That's not survivor's guilt. That's doing my job. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, a brief expression that transformed his severe features. Fair enough. For what it's worth, I flew A-10s in Desert Storm. I've made some of the same calculations you made yesterday. Sometimes the textbook answer gets people killed. He looked around the table at his fellow officers. Unless anyone has additional questions, I think we're done here. Cortez shook her head. Brooks closed his tablet. Harrison was already gathering his materials. The debriefing was over. Adrian stood, years of military discipline keeping her posture straight despite the fatigue that pressed against her bones. She'd been awake for 28 hours, had flown a mission that should have killed her, and was now being evaluated by people whose decisions could end her career. But she was still standing. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of administrative requirements. Medical evaluations confirmed what Adrian already knew. She was physically exhausted but uninjured. Psychological screening proved more complicated. The base psychologist, a thoughtful major named Williams, had conducted a 2-hour interview that probed the edges of trauma, grief, and professional competency. You understand, Williams had said, that the Air Force needs to be certain you're flying for the right reasons. Not to punish yourself, not to join your husband, but because you're an effective combat pilot. Adrian had answered honestly, or as honestly as anyone could when discussing the complicated mathematics of loss and purpose. Yes, she thought about Danny. Yes, flying was how she processed grief. No, she wasn't suicidal. Yes, she could distinguish between acceptable risk and recklessness. The psychologist had made notes, asked follow-up questions, and ultimately cleared her for continued flight status pending the official review board decision. On the 4th day, she received orders to report to the wing commander's office. Colonel Marcus Devereaux was a fighter pilot by background, F-15s mostly, with a reputation for running a tight ship while actually caring about the people under his command. He stood when she entered, gestured to a chair. "Colonel Kane, sit." She sat. On his desk, she could see her personnel file open to the commendations page. Next to it, the after-action report from her mission, marked with several sticky note flags. Devereaux settled back into his own chair, steepled his fingers, and regarded her with the expression of a man working through a complex problem. I've read every report. I've talked to everyone involved. The SEALs, the tanker crew, Captain Reeves, the review board officers. You know what the consensus is? Sir, I'd prefer not to guess. That you're either the best close air support pilot in theater or completely insane. Maybe both. He smiled slightly. The SEAL team commander called you an angel of death. He meant it as a compliment. The tanker boom operator said refueling you was like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. Also a compliment in its way. Adrian remained silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. The review board is split. Half think you should be grounded for reckless endangerment. Half think you should be teaching at weapons school. I'm the tiebreaker. Devereaux stood, walked to the window overlooking the flight line. From this vantage point, they could see rows of aircraft F-16s, A-10s, helicopters of various types, the machinery of modern warfare arranged in neat geometric patterns. I lost a wingman once, he said quietly. Training accident over Nevada. We were running a simulated combat scenario and he pushed too hard in a turn, overstressed the airframe. Aircraft came apart at 8,000 feet. He didn't eject in time. He turned back to face her. I spent 2 years wondering if I could have prevented it, if I'd seen the signs earlier, called for him to break off the engagement, something. The accident investigation cleared me, said it was pilot error on his part, but I still wonder. Adrian understood what he was offering, not absolution, but recognition that survival came with its own burden. Sir, I'm not trying to kill myself. If that's the concern, that's not my concern, Colonel. My concern is whether you can continue to make sound tactical decisions under pressure, or if you've reached a point where the line between calculated risk and suicide mission has blurred too much. He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small box, the distinctive blue of Air Force Awards packaging. I'm approving the Distinguished Flying Cross. You earned it, regardless of what else happened. But I'm also ordering you to take 2 weeks of mandatory leave. Not suspension, not punishment, actual leave. Go to Germany, visit the beach, do something that doesn't involve sitting in a cockpit. Sir, the squadron needs, the squadron will manage. What it can't manage is losing you because you burned out and made a mistake that gets you killed. His voice was firm but not unkind. You're a valuable asset, Adrian. You're also a human being who's been operating at maximum stress for 7 years. Take the leave. That's an order, not a suggestion. She recognized the futility of arguing. Orders were orders. Yes, sir. Good, your leave starts immediately. There's a transport heading to Ramstein tomorrow morning. Be on it. He extended his hand across the desk. And Colonel, thank you for bringing those SEALs home. Whatever else happens, that mission mattered. She shook his hand, felt the calluses that came from years in cockpits, the physical legacy of a life spent flying. Thank you, sir. Ramstein Air Base in Germany felt like a different planet. Clean buildings, manicured lawns, the ordered efficiency of a major logistics hub far from active combat. Adrian had landed 6 hours ago, processed through in processing with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this at a dozen different bases, and found herself assigned a room in the temporary quarters facility. It was, by any objective measure, nicer than her quarters at Bagram. It felt empty. She'd spent the first afternoon walking the base, trying to recalibrate to an environment where people didn't carry weapons as a matter of course, where the biggest threat was boredom rather than rockets. The base exchange sold things beyond tactical gear and energy drinks, actual civilian clothes, books, electronics that hadn't been beaten to hell by deployment conditions. She'd bought a novel on impulse, something about a woman finding herself through baking bread, and immediately questioned the choice. That evening, sitting in a restaurant on base that attempted to approximate American dining, she'd stared at a menu with too many choices and felt completely out of place. A captain at the next table had recognized her word traveled fast in military communities and offered to buy her a drink. She declined politely, needing solitude more than company. Now it was her second day of leave, and she was trying to figure out what people did with free time when they weren't flying combat missions. The gym seemed like a safe option. Physical training was familiar territory, a way to burn off the restless energy that made sitting still feel like failure. She'd run 5 miles on a treadmill, lifted weights until her arms shook, and finally admitted that she was using exercise as a substitute for the adrenaline rush of combat. In the shower afterward, she'd caught herself mentally reviewing the fuel calculations from the mission, running through the numbers again to verify she'd made the right calls. This was the problem with mandatory leave. It gave you time to think, and thinking led to questions you'd successfully avoided while busy staying alive. Had she been reckless? Yes, objectively. Had it been necessary? She believed so, but belief wasn't the same as certainty. Would she do it again, without hesitation? That answer worried her more than she wanted to admit. The phone call came on day 5. Adrian was reading in her quarter sheet, made it 40 pages into the bread baking book before accepting it wasn't holding her attention, when her cell phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Military personnel learn to answer unfamiliar numbers. They might be anything from deployment orders to emergency notifications. Colonel Kane. Colonel, this is Lieutenant Commander Jake Mathies. I was the SEAL team leader you pulled out of that valley. His voice carried that distinctive confidence of special operations personnel, men who'd seen enough combat to know their own capabilities. I got your number from Captain Reeves. Hope that's okay. Commander, what can I do for you? Well, ma'am, my team and I wanted to thank you properly. We're in Landstuhl for medical checks, nothing serious, just standard post-mission protocols. We heard you're at Ramstein on leave. We'd like to buy you dinner. Adrian's immediate instinct was to decline. She didn't need thanks, she'd been doing her job. But something in Mathies's voice suggested this wasn't optional, that for these men expressing gratitude was its own kind of necessity. When and where? Tonight, 1800 hours. There's a Gasthaus in Landstuhl, place called Der Adler. Best schnitzel outside of Austria, or so I'm told. I'll text you the address. I'll be there, Commander. Jake, please, I think we're past formalities. After he hung up, Adrian sat holding the phone, processing the implications. Meeting the men she'd saved would make it real in a way that after-action reports and debriefings never could. In the cockpit, focused on targeting solutions and fuel management, they'd been abstract entities, friendlies to be protected. Now they'd have faces, voices, stories. She wasn't sure she was ready for that level of connection. But orders were orders, even informal ones from grateful SEALs. She checked the time, 4 hours until dinner. Enough time to find civilian clothes, maybe something that didn't scream military officer on forced vacation. The base exchange yielded a simple outfit: dark jeans, a neutral sweater, clothing that would let her blend into the background. She caught her reflection in the dressing room mirror. 38 years old, fit but tired, eyes that had seen too much but hadn't quite figured out how to look away. Der Adler occupied a corner in Landstuhl's old town, the kind of traditional German restaurant that had probably been serving food in the same location for 200 years. Heavy wooden beams, leaded glass windows, the smell of roasted meat and beer. Adrian arrived exactly at 1800, punctuality trained into her bones by 2 decades of military service. The SEALs were already there, impossible to miss even in civilian clothes. 12 men distributed across 2 pushed-together tables, their body language and bearing marking them as military regardless of what they wore. Mathies spotted her immediately, stood, crossed the room with the efficient movement of someone accustomed to combat environments. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 32, with the kind of weathered face that came from too many deployments in harsh climates. Colonel Kane, thanks for coming. He gestured toward the tables. Everyone's been looking forward to this. The introductions blurred together, names, ranks, specialties. Most were petty officers, the enlisted backbone of special operations. 2 were junior officers. All of them looked at her with expressions that mixed respect, curiosity, and something harder to define. Perhaps the recognition that they were alive because of decisions she'd made in moments they hadn't witnessed. They'd ordered German beer, plates of bread and cheese already covering the tables. Someone pulled out a chair for her, and suddenly she was seated among them, accepting a beer she didn't particularly want but understood was symbolically necessary. Matthijs raised his glass. To Colonel Kane, who proved that angels don't need wings, they just need GAU-8 cannons and questionable decision-making skills. The table erupted in laughter and agreement. They drank, and Adrian felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. These weren't men looking for a hero to worship. They were professionals acknowledging another professional who'd done her job exceptionally well. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" This from a petty officer whose name tape had read MORRSON. "That valley, we were in a bad spot, I mean really bad. We'd been pinned for almost an hour, ammunition getting low, no clear extraction route. Then we heard you. The A-10's engines, that specific sound. And I remember thinking, someone actually came." Morrison continued, his hands gesturing to illustrate the tactical situation. "The thing is, we'd called for close air support 20 minutes earlier, got told no assets available, stand by for possible Apache support in 40 mics. We were pretty sure we weren't going to last 40 minutes. He paused, taking a drink of beer. "So what I'm asking is, how'd you even know we needed help?" Adrian set down her own beer, considering how much to explain. These men had operational security clearances. They understood the architecture of military communications and decision-making. "I was finishing a different mission, routine patrol over the Kunar province. I'd been monitoring the emergency frequencies, heard your initial contact report before you went dark, checked with Bagram, confirmed no assets were scrambled for immediate response. The geometry worked. I had fuel, I had ordnance, I was close enough to make a difference." "So you just diverted?" Matthijs asked. "Without clearance. The way I figured it, I could ask permission and get tangled in coordination for 15 minutes while you died, or I could show up and apologize later." She met his eyes. Seemed like a straightforward decision. Another SEAL, a chief petty officer named Hendricks, laughed, a short bark of appreciation. "Ma'am, I've been in the teams for 12 years. I've worked with every kind of air support you can imagine. Most pilots are good, some are great, but you're the first one I've met who just said fuck the bureaucracy and showed up like it was the most natural thing in the world. Chief, I'd appreciate if we kept that particular phrasing out of any official statements." "Yes, ma'am, but between us, that's exactly what happened and we're grateful for it." The food arrived, massive plates of schnitzel, spätzle, roasted vegetables. German portions designed for people who spent their days doing physical labor. The conversation shifted to easier topics: previous deployments, shared acquaintances in the special operations community, the peculiarities of operating in Afghanistan. Adrian found herself relaxing, the professional camaraderie familiar and comfortable in a way that social interactions rarely were. Halfway through dinner, a younger petty officer, Thompson, barely 25, spoke up quietly. "Ma'am, can I ask about the call sign? Widow." The table went silent. Matthijs shot Thompson a look that suggested he'd crossed a line, but Adrian raised a hand. "It's fine, Commander." She set down her fork, gathering thoughts about a subject she rarely discussed. 7 years ago, my husband was a pilot assigned to the 352nd Special Operations Wing, MC-130s, infiltration and exfiltration missions. He died in a crash at Kandahar, mechanical failure during takeoff. 38 people on that aircraft. No survivors. She could recite the facts without emotion now, having practiced the detachment required to function after catastrophic loss. "After the funeral, I went back to flying. People started calling me widow, initially as gossip. I decided to own it, turned it into my official call sign. Seemed appropriate. I was alone, I was flying alone, might as well acknowledge it." Thompson looked stricken, clearly wishing he hadn't asked. But Matthijs nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. "Loss gives you clarity," he said quietly. "Makes it easier to take risks when you've already lived through the worst thing that could happen. Something like that." Adrian picked up her fork again, signaling the subject was closed. "Also makes you appreciate mission success. Bringing you home meant 12 families didn't get the notification I received. That's worth whatever administrative headaches I'm dealing with." Hendricks raised his glass again. "To bringing people home." "To bringing people home," the table echoed. They drank, and the moment passed into the easier rhythm of a shared meal among people who understood the stakes of their profession. As dinner wound down and the plates were cleared, one of the junior officers, Ensign Parker, pulled out a tablet. "Ma'am, we took the liberty of putting together something. Not official, just from us." He turned the screen to show a photograph, clearly taken just before this dinner. The 12 SEALs arranged in formation, holding a sign that read, "We owe Widow 12 beers in our lives. The debt stands." Below the text, they'd all signed their names. "We're having it printed and framed," Parker explained. "One copy for you, one for our team room, so we don't forget who showed up when it mattered." Adrian looked at the image, these men who'd survived because of fuel calculations and trajectory mathematics and her willingness to ignore protocol. Something tight and painful in her chest loosened fractionally. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." The remainder of her leave passed with surprising speed. Adrian spent 2 days exploring the German countryside, renting a car and driving through small villages that seemed untouched by the wars that had shaped her adult life. She visited Heidelberg, walked along the Neckar River, tried to understand what normal people did with their lives when they weren't preparing for or recovering from combat deployments. In a bookstore in Heidelberg, she'd found a technical manual on aerodynamics and bought it immediately, comfort reading for someone whose definition of relaxation was deeply skewed. The bread-baking novel remained at 40 pages, abandoned in her quarters. On day 12, she received an email from Colonel Devereaux. The subject line read, "Assignment orders read immediately." Her finger hesitated over the open button, aware that these orders would determine whether she returned to flying or found herself assigned to a desk somewhere. Her career effectively ended. She opened the email. The text was characteristically concise. "Colonel Kane, your appeal to the review board has been successful. You are cleared to return to flight status effective immediately upon completion of leave. However, the board has mandated quarterly psychological evaluations and required you to fly with a wingman on all combat missions for the next 6 months. Non-negotiable. Additionally, you've been requested by name for a temporary assignment to Nellie's AFB to assist with tactical instruction. Details to follow. The beer tab from the SEAL team is now officially your problem. They've been calling the squadron daily. Devereaux." Adrian read the email 3 times, parsing the implications. Cleared to fly meant her career survived. Mandatory evaluations meant they still had concerns. Wingman requirements were reasonable, even appropriate. But the Nellie's assignment, that was interesting. Weapons school at Nellie's was where the Air Force sent its best pilots to become even better, to develop the tactics and procedures that would disseminate throughout the force. Being invited to teach there, even temporarily, was a significant vote of confidence. She closed the laptop, walked to the window of her quarters, and looked out over Ramstein's flight line. In the distance, an aircraft was taking off. She couldn't identify the type from this angle, but the sight of something climbing into the sky felt like a promise. 3 days of leave remained. She'd use them to prepare mentally for the return to operations, to process everything that had happened, to make peace with the fact that she would continue flying combat missions despite knowing the risks. The flight back to Afghanistan felt different. Adrian sat in the cargo bay of a C-17, surrounded by personnel and equipment heading into theater. Most were replacements, fresh-faced lieutenants and sergeants who hadn't yet acquired the 1,000-yard stare that came from extended combat exposure. She'd nodded politely at introductions, but mostly kept to herself, using the flight time to review technical publications on her tablet. C-17's crew chief, a master sergeant with 20 years of service evident in his bearing, had recognized her name when she'd checked in. "Your widow, right? The pilot who did that crazy refueling in a glide." Word really did travel at the speed of gossip in military circles. "That's me, Sergeant. My cousin works maintenance at Bagram. Said you brought back an A-10 that should have been written off as combat loss. Said the jet had damage she didn't even know could happen and still stay airborne. The Warthog's tough. That's the whole point of the design." The sergeant had grinned. "Yeah, but most pilots don't test that toughness quite so thoroughly. Anyway, good to have you back in theater, ma'am. We need more pilots willing to show up when things go sideways. Now, as the C-17 began its descent into Bagram, Adrian felt the familiar mental transition from leave status to combat operations. Personal concerns compartmentalized, focus narrowing to mission requirements, the professional detachment that made it possible to fly into hostile airspace and make life-or-death decisions without paralysis. The landing was smooth. Air Force transport pilots prided themselves on making heavy aircraft dance, and taxi to the ramp took only minutes. Afghanistan greeted her with its usual combination of dust, heat, and the particular smell of a combat airfield. Jet fuel burning trash from the incineration facility, and the indefinable odor of too many people living in close proximity under stressful conditions. Captain Reeves met her at the terminal, looking tired but pleased. "Colonel Kane, welcome back. How was leave?" "Productive, sir. Got some rest, met with the SEAL team, came to terms with mandatory psych evals." "Yeah, about those." Reeves gestured toward a waiting vehicle. "Dr. Williams wants to see you tomorrow for baseline assessment. But first, the squadron has prepared a small welcome back. Nothing formal, just people wanting to acknowledge what you did." The squadron bar at Bagram was technically unauthorized. Regulations prohibited alcohol consumption in theater, but existed anyway in that gray zone, where commanders looked the other way as long as no one caused problems. It occupied a modified shipping container, decorated with unit patches and photos of aircraft, supplied with beer that someone procured through channels no one examined too closely. Adrian walked in to find approximately 40 people crammed into a space designed for 20. Pilots, maintenance crews, ground controllers, even a few administrative personnel who had no direct connection to flight operations but wanted to be part of the moment. The room erupted in applause. Someone had hung a banner reading "Welcome Back, Widow" alongside a photograph of an A-10 in flight. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vega, stepped forward with a beer in each hand, offering one to Adrian. "You know the rules. What happens in the squadron bar stays in the squadron bar." Adrian accepted the beer, raised it in acknowledgement of the crowd. "Thank you all, though I should mention that if anyone here writes a book about this, I'm denying everything." Laughter rippled through the room. Vega gestured for quiet, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Adrian, what you did out there wasn't just good flying. It was the kind of mission that reminds everyone why we do this job. You saved 12 lives because you were willing to trust your training, trust your aircraft, and make decisions that required courage most of us hope we never have to find." She pulled something from her pocket, a small unit coin, custom minted, featuring an A-10 on one side and the words "Widow's Run" on the other. "The squadron took the liberty of commissioning these. Everyone here gets one, so we all remember that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing they tell you not to do." Adrian turned the coin over in her hand, feeling its weight. Challenge coins were a military tradition, small tokens of recognition and belonging. This one would join dozens of others in her collection, but she knew it would occupy a special place. The evening progressed with the easy camaraderie of people who shared dangerous work. Stories were exchanged, most of them exaggerated, all of them containing kernels of truth about near misses and successful missions. Adrian found herself surrounded by her crew chief, a technical sergeant named Rodriguez who'd kept her aircraft flying through 3 deployments. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something," Rodriguez said, pulling Adrian slightly aside from the main group. His expression was serious, the professional concern of someone who took his responsibilities personally. "I did the post-mission inspection on your bird after that valley run, the one where you flamed out and glided into the refueling. And Adrian knew aircraft maintenance personnel saw details pilots often missed, the subtle stresses and damage that accumulated from hard use. Ma'am, you had a hydraulic line that was about 6 hours from catastrophic failure. Different line than the one that took your engines, but if it had gone during the mission," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you wouldn't have had flight control authority. The backup system would have kept you in the air, but precision maneuvering like you did, probably not possible." Adrian absorbed this information, processing the implications. She'd been flying on borrowed time, margins even thinner than she'd realized. Did you document it in the maintenance logs? Yes, ma'am. Replaced the entire hydraulic assembly, stress-tested every system. She's ready to fly again, but I wanted you to know how close things were. He met her eyes. I've been working on A-10s for 15 years. I've seen pilots push these aircraft hard, seen them take damage and keep flying. But what you did, the margins you were operating on, that was something different. Sergeant, are you suggesting I was lucky? No, ma'am. Luck is random. You were good, you were skilled, and yeah, the circumstances aligned in your favor, but being aware of how narrow those margins were might be useful information going forward. It was the closest Rodriguez would come to suggesting she'd taken unnecessary risks. Adrian appreciated his professionalism, the way he delivered criticism disguised as information. Point taken, Sergeant. I'll keep it in mind. That's all I ask, ma'am. He raised his beer in a small salute. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to explain to the new crew chief why we don't use unapproved fasteners on weapons pylons, no matter how much faster it seems. Adrian watched him go, this man who kept her aircraft airworthy, whose expertise stood between her and mechanical failure. The military ran on the competence of people like Rodriguez, specialists who did their jobs with quiet excellence while more visible personnel got the recognition. The party wound down around midnight. Adrian had nursed the single beer through the entire evening. Maintaining the careful sobriety she'd learned was necessary even in off-duty hours. Pilots needed to be able to scramble on short notice, and showing up drunk to combat mission was a court-martial offense that no amount of skill could excuse. She walked back to her quarters alone, enjoying the relative cool of the Afghan night. The base was quiet, most personnel either sleeping or working night shifts. Guard towers lit the perimeter, and in the distance she could hear the sound of a helicopter returning from a mission. Her quarters were exactly as she'd left them 3 weeks ago, sparse, functional, decorated only with a few personal items that had survived multiple deployments. A photo of her and Danny at their wedding, both of them impossibly young and optimistic. A unit patch from her first squadron. A paperback copy of The Right Stuff, read so many times the spine had cracked. She sat on the edge of her bunk, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the mission, the review board, the leave, and the welcome back celebration finally drained away, leaving only fatigue. Tomorrow would bring a return to regular flight schedules, routine missions, the daily work of combat operations. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The mission had changed something fundamental. Not her skill, that remained constant, refined through thousands of hours of practice. Not her dedication, she'd always been committed to the mission. What had changed was her relationship with risk, her understanding of the line between acceptable hazard and recklessness. Rodriguez's words echoed, margins narrower than she'd realized. The hydraulic line that could have failed. The fuel that could have run out 30 seconds earlier. The boom operator who could have missed the connection. She'd survived through a combination of skill and circumstances that aligned in her favor. Next time, those circumstances might not align. Adrian lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Sleep would come eventually, bringing dreams that mixed past and present, Danny's face and burning aircraft in valleys filled with hostile fire. But for now, she was alive, she was cleared to fly, and tomorrow would bring new missions. The Widow would fly again. The briefing room at 700 was full of the familiar faces of pilots preparing for the day's missions. Adrian sat in the back row, tablet open to the day's air tasking order, reviewing her assignment. Nothing dramatic, routine patrol over Helmand Province, 4-hour mission, paired with Captain James Chen in a 2-ship formation. The mandatory wingman requirement from the review board in action. Lieutenant Colonel Vega ran through the daily brief with practiced efficiency. Weather conditions, threat assessments, ground force operations that might require air support, tanker locations and frequencies. Standard information delivered in standard format, the military's love of procedure ensuring everyone had access to the same baseline knowledge. When Vega reached Adrian's mission, she paused slightly. Widow and Sabre 2-1, your patrol sector includes recent Taliban activity. Intelligence suggests possible weapons cache in grid square Papa Tango 47. Recommend visual reconnaissance if tactical situation permits. Rules of engagement standard positive identification required before weapons release. Chen, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned to give Adrian a thumbs up. He was a good pilot, methodical and steady, exactly the kind of wingman she'd want for a relatively quiet patrol mission. They'd flown together before. He knew her tendencies and she knew his capabilities. After the brief, they walked together to flight operations for mission planning. Chen spread out a map on the planning table, marking waypoints and communication boundaries. "So, how does it feel to be famous?" he asked, his tone light but genuine. "Exhausting. I preferred anonymity." "Yeah, well, pulling off impossible missions tends to attract attention. You know they're already writing up the refueling as a case study for weapons school." "I'd heard rumors." Adrian marked a potential divert airfield on the map. "Any thoughts on the patrol route?" "I was thinking we run the northern corridor first, work our way south. Gives us better sun angle for visual recon of that weapons cache location." She nodded approval. Chen thought tactically, considered factors beyond simply flying the route. "Works for me." Loadout. Standard mix Mavericks full-gun rockets. "We're not expecting heavy contact, but I'd rather have the capability and not need it." They spent another 20 minutes refining the mission plan, coordinating communication protocols, establishing contingency procedures. The careful preparation that made routine missions routine, reducing risk through planning and professionalism. The walk to the aircraft felt familiar, boots crunching on gravel, the morning sun already heating the air to uncomfortable levels. Adrian's A-10 waited in its revetment, the distinctive profile unmistakable high-mounted engines, straight wings, nose that housed the massive GAU-8 cannon. Rodriguez was conducting pre-flight checks, walking around the aircraft with a practiced eye for anything out of place. "Morning, Sergeant. How's she looking?" "Perfect, ma'am. Replaced that hydraulic line, ran full systems diagnostics, loaded your ordnance personally. She's ready to fly." Rodriguez handed her the maintenance logbook, pointing to the relevant entries. "All green across the board." Adrian reviewed the logs, confirming what Rodriguez had said. The maintenance personnel at Bagram were exceptional, keeping aging aircraft airworthy through skill and dedication that often went unrecognized. "Thanks, Sergeant. I'll try not to bring her back with new holes." "I appreciate that, ma'am. But if you do, I'll patch them up. That's the deal." She climbed the ladder to the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the comfort of long familiarity. The A-10's cockpit was utilitarian, designed for function over comfort. Instruments and displays covered every available surface, controls positioned for easy access during combat maneuvering. She ran through pre-flight checks methodically. Flight controls, hydraulic pressure, electrical systems, weapon status. Each item verified, each system confirming readiness. The engines spun up with their characteristic whine, turbofans building to operating speed. She checked in with ground control, received taxi clearance and began the slow roll toward the runway. Chen's aircraft followed 20 seconds behind, maintaining proper spacing for formation takeoff. At the runway, Adrian ran through final checks, received takeoff clearance from the tower, and advanced throttles to maximum power. They accelerated with deceptive speed for such an ungainly-looking aircraft, main gear lifting off at 120 knots, climbing into the clear Afghan sky. The familiar sensation of flight washed over her, the subtle feedback through the controls, the engine vibration transmitted through the airframe, the visual reference of ground falling away. This was home, this place between earth and sky where purpose crystallized into action. Chen's voice came through on the tactical frequency. "Widow, Sabre 2-1 is airborne, joining on your right." The patrol route took them north over terrain that shifted from cultivated valleys to bare mountains to desert plains within the span of 20 miles. Afghanistan's geography was nothing if not diverse, each region presenting unique tactical challenges and operational considerations. Adrian maintained altitude at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most ground fire, low enough to provide effective observation of the ground below. Chen flew formation off her right wing, maintaining proper spacing close enough for mutual support, far enough to avoid mid-air collision if one of them had to maneuver suddenly. They'd been airborne for 90 minutes, methodically working through their patrol sectors when the radio crackled with a transmission from ground forces. Any aircraft, this is Guardian 3-6. We have troops in contact, requesting immediate close air support. Grid Square Papa Tango 4-5, multiple hostiles engaging from fortified positions. Adrian checked her map. Papa Tango 4-5 was 12 miles northwest of their current position, well within their response capability. She keyed the radio. Guardian 3-6, Widow flight of 2 A-10s 12 miles south your position. We can be overhead in 4 minutes. Authenticate. The ground controller transmitted the proper authentication code, confirming they were legitimate friendly forces and not an enemy attempting to lure aircraft into an ambush. Adrian ran through mental calculations: fuel sufficient, ordnance appropriate, tactical situation within their rules of engagement. Chen, you copy that contact report. Copy, Widow, I'm with you. They banked left in unison, descending toward the contact area. Adrian switched frequencies to talk directly with the ground controller. Guardian 3-6, Widow flight inbound. Describe your tactical situation. Widow, we have a platoon pinned by fire from a compound, approximately 15 hostiles with small arms and one probable heavy machine gun. Friendlies marked by purple smoke. Hostiles are in the 2-story building at Grid Papa Tango 4532. Purple smoke rose from the ground ahead, a visible marker in the morning light. Adrian spotted the compound, typical Afghan construction, mud brick walls surrounding several buildings, the tallest being the 2-story structure the controller mentioned. As they approached, she could see muzzle flashes from windows on the 2nd floor. The tactical picture became clear quickly. U.S. forces were caught in open ground, using a low berm for cover while taking fire from an elevated position. Classic ambush setup, enemy using terrain and structure to maximum advantage. Adrian circled the compound, analyzing angles and positions. The friendlies were dangerously close to the building, maybe 150 meters, close enough that any weapons employment required precision to avoid fratricide. The enemy held excellent defensive position, able to fire down at the pinned troops while remaining partially protected by the building structure. Guardian 3-6, Widow. Confirm friendlies are at least 200 meters from target building. Widow, negative. Closest friendly position is approximately 150 meters. We're pinned and can't withdraw without taking casualties. Chen's voice came through on their internal frequency. That's tight for gun runs. Maverick might be better option. Maverick would take out the entire building. Too much potential for collateral damage if there are civilians inside. Adrian ran through scenarios, calculating blast radii and fragmentation patterns. I'm thinking precision gun pass, 2nd floor only. You set up for follow-up if I miss. Copy. I'll hold high, be ready to engage. She descended to 8,000 feet, setting up her approach vector. The GAU-8 cannon could deliver devastating firepower, but it required precise flying. She needed to align her flight path so the cannon's rounds would impact only the 2nd floor, avoiding both the ground floor where civilians might be sheltering and the friendly forces beyond. The A-10's heads-up display painted the target building in synthetic green. She designated the 2nd floor, let the ballistic computer calculate the exact firing solution, then cross-check the math manually. Trust but verify, the pilot's creed. Guardian 3-6, Widow is in hot. Recommend your personnel take cover. Copy, Widow. We're as covered as we're getting. Adrian rolled into her attack run, descending at an angle that would give her the geometry she needed. Airspeed 250 knots, altitude unwinding through 5,000 feet, target growing larger in her windscreen. The world narrowed to the mechanics of the attack: sight picture, trigger discipline, timing. At 3,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, the aircraft shuddering as 70 rounds per second screamed downrange. She held the trigger for 2 seconds, 140 rounds of 30mm ammunition walking across the 2nd floor of the target building. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The 2nd floor essentially disintegrated, walls collapsing inward, roof structure falling. Adrian pulled hard on the stick, climbing away from the target area as debris fountained into the air. Behind her, the compound's second floor was gone, reduced to rubble and dust. She keyed the radio while bringing the aircraft around for damage assessment. Guardian 3-6, Widow, assess my last. Widow, Guardian 3-6, that was right on target. Enemy fire has ceased. We're no longer taking contact. Beautiful shooting, ma'am. Relief flooded the ground controller's voice, the audible release of tension that came when immediate danger passed. Chen had remained high, watching the engagement, ready to follow up if needed. Widow, Saber 2-1, that was textbook. I don't think they're going to need my help. Adrian circled once more, confirming the enemy position was neutralized, scanning for any additional threats or movement that might indicate reinforcements. The compound was quiet, dust settling over what remained of the two-story building. Below, U.S. forces were already moving, conducting battle damage assessment and securing the area. Guardian 3-6, Widow Flight, will remain on station for another 20 mics if you need us. After that, we're bingo fuel and need to RTB. Copy, Widow. We've got this from here. Thanks for the save. Guardian 3-6 out. The rest of the patrol passed without incident. They completed their assigned route, conducted the visual reconnaissance of the suspected weapons cache, finding nothing worth engaging, and turned back toward Bagram with fuel levels comfortable but not excessive. Chen maintained formation throughout, professional and competent, exactly the kind of reliable wingman the review board had mandated. On final approach to Bagram, Adrian reflected on the mission. It had been routine by combat standards, troops in contact, close air support delivered, threat neutralized. No dramatic fuel emergencies, no impossible decisions, just professional application of training and experience to solve a tactical problem. This was what flying was supposed to be. Difficult, demanding work performed with skill and precision, achieving mission objectives without unnecessary drama. But even routine missions carried risk. The friendlies had been close 150 meters from impact, well within the danger zone for ricochets or miscalculation. She'd trusted her training, trusted her aircraft, trusted the ballistic computer's calculations. And it had worked, because that's what happened when you prepared properly and executed carefully. The post-mission debrief lasted 40 minutes. Adrian and Chen walked through every phase of the flight, documenting decisions, discussing the close air support engagement, reviewing fuel consumption and weapons expenditure. Lieutenant Colonel Vega listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, generally letting them tell the story without interruption. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, expression thoughtful. Good mission. Clean execution, no deviations from procedure. Guardian 3-6 has already sent a thank you message through channels. She looked directly at Adrian. How did it feel flying with a wingman? Natural, ma'am. Chen's good. Having backup made the tactical decisions easier. That's the point. The review board wants you flying with support, and based on this mission, I'd say the arrangement is working. Vega stood, signaling the debrief was complete. Get some rest. You're on the flight schedule again tomorrow, different sector but same basic mission. We'll keep you busy. Adrian returned to her quarters, the afternoon heat making the simple walk feel like crossing a desert. Inside, she stripped off her flight suit, stood under the lukewarm shower that was the best the facilities offered, and let the water wash away dust and sweat. In the mirror afterward, she studied her reflection, same face as always, but perhaps slightly less strained than it had been before her forced leave. Maybe Devereaux had been right about the need for rest. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her quarters and wrote an email to the SEAL team, thanking them for dinner and the framed photograph. Writing didn't come easily. She was better with numbers and tactical solutions than words, but some things required the effort. She mentioned that she was back flying, that the review board had cleared her, that she hoped their own missions were going well. Simple communication, the maintenance of connection with people who understood the weight of combat operations. Before bed, she pulled up the mission file for tomorrow's flight, reviewing the patrol route and expected threats. Preparation was its own form of meditation, the familiar ritual of studying maps and weather forecasts and intelligence reports. Some pilots could compartmentalize completely, turning off the professional mindset when off duty. Adrian had never acquired that skill. Flying was what she did, but it was also who she was, and the two had become inseparable years ago. The next morning brought rain, unusual for Afghanistan but not unprecedented. The brief included weather updates: clouds at 8,000 feet, visibility reduced, winds gusting to 25 knots. Challenging conditions but within operational limits for experienced pilots. Adrian's wingman for this mission was Lieutenant Sarah Keating, a younger pilot with less combat experience but solid fundamentals. They'd flown together once before, a routine patrol where nothing significant happened, which was usually the best outcome anyone could hope for. "Morning, ma'am," Keating approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Adrian. "Thought you might need this before we brief." "Thanks, Lieutenant. How are you feeling about today's weather?" "It'll be interesting. I've flown in worse but not in theater. Any guidance?" Adrian appreciated the question. Keating was smart enough to leverage available experience rather than pretending she knew everything. "Trust your instruments more than your eyes when we're in the clouds. Keep your scan going, don't fixate on any single gauge. If you start feeling disoriented, say so immediately. Spatial disorientation kills more pilots than enemy fire." "Copy that, ma'am." They reviewed the mission together, discussing how weather would affect their patrol pattern and what modifications they might need to make to standard procedures. Keating asked good questions, the kind that demonstrated she was thinking about contingencies and risks rather than just following the flight plan mechanically. The pre-flight walk-around revealed nothing unusual. Rodriguez had the aircraft ready, all systems green, weapons loaded according to the air tasking order. The rain had stopped, leaving the flight line wet and the air thick with humidity. "She's all yours, ma'am," Rodriguez said, handing over the logbook. "Try to keep her pretty." "I always try, Sergeant. Success may vary." Climbing into the cockpit felt like coming home. Adrian ran through her checks, started the engines, and taxied to the runway with Keating following in trail. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and moments later they were airborne, climbing through scattered clouds toward their patrol altitude. The weather was worse than brief. Clouds were lower and thicker, requiring them to climb through solid instrument conditions before breaking out on top at 10,000 feet. The patrol sector for today was the Kandahar province, terrain Adrian knew well from previous deployments. They'd been airborne for an hour, maintaining altitude above the weather, when Keating's voice came through on tactical frequency. "Widow, Sabre 17. I'm getting a master caution light, checking now." Adrian immediately focused on Keating's aircraft, visible off her left wing. No obvious signs of damage or smoke, but master caution lights indicated something wrong with a primary system. "Sabre 17, Widow, what's your status?" "Running diagnostics now, looks like. Hydraulic pressure fluctuation in the primary system. Pressure is varying between 2,800 and 3,200 psi. Should be steady at 3,000. A hydraulic fluctuation could indicate anything from a minor sensor issue to a developing leak that would eventually cause system failure." Adrian's mind immediately went to Rodriguez's words about the hydraulic line that had been close to failure on her own aircraft. "Sabre 17, what does your backup hydraulic system show?" "Backup is normal, steady pressure, all green." "Copy. Recommend we begin RTB while you still have full control authority. We'll stay above the weather, direct route to Bagram." Keating acknowledged, and they turned toward home. Adrian maintained close formation, watching Keating's aircraft for any signs of deterioration. Hydraulic systems controlled flight surfaces, landing gear, weapons systems. Losing them completely would turn the aircraft into a very expensive glider. 10 minutes into their return flight, Keating's voice came through again, this time with an edge of tension. "Widow, my primary hydraulic pressure just dropped to 2,000 psi and falling. Backup is still good, but I'm losing the primary." "Copy. Declare an emergency with Bagram. Let them know we're inbound with hydraulic failure." Adrian switched frequencies to contact the tower herself, giving them a heads-up that they'd have an aircraft landing with degraded systems. Emergency crews would preposition, fire trucks and medical personnel ready in case the landing went wrong. Sabre 17, how's your control feel? Any sluggishness or unusual response? No ma'am, still feels normal. Backup system is holding, no control issues yet. Yet, that word carried weight. Backup systems were designed to work, but they weren't intended for extended use, and they could fail just like primary systems. They descended through the weather layer, Adrian talking Keating through the instrument approach with calm precision. The visibility was poor, rain reducing visual range to maybe 2 miles, clouds creating a gray ceiling that made depth perception challenging. Sabre 17, you're at 12 o'clock for the runway, 6 miles. Gear down. Gear coming down. I'm showing 3 green, gear down and locked. Adrian could see Keating's aircraft now, gear extended, the ungainly profile of an A-10 configured for landing. Everything looked normal from the outside, but she knew hydraulic failures could be deceptive. Things could be fine right up until the moment they catastrophically weren't. Sabre 17, you're looking good. On glide slope on center line. Just fly the airplane, let the backup system do its job. Copy, Widow. Keating's voice was tight but controlled. Good discipline fear was acceptable as long as it didn't paralyze decision-making. The runway appeared through the rain, gray concrete stretching into the distance. Keating's approach was stable, airspeed right on target, descent rate perfect. Adrian held her own aircraft in a pattern to observe, ready to provide guidance if needed but mostly just being present as backup. Keating's main gear touched down smoothly, then the nose gear, a textbook landing despite the degraded systems. The A-10 rolled out, slowing normally, turning off at the midfield taxiway. Emergency vehicles followed at a discreet distance, ready to respond but not needed. Sabre 17, nice work. Take it to the maintenance area, shut her down, and let Rodriguez's people figure out what failed. Copy, Widow. Thanks for the coaching. Adrian landed her own aircraft, taxied to her revetment, and shut down. As she climbed out, she could see Keating's aircraft already surrounded by maintenance personnel, Rodriguez leading the effort to diagnose the hydraulic issue. This was military aviation success measured not just by missions completed but by everyone coming home alive. Later that afternoon, Rodriguez found Adrian in the Squadron Operations Center. Ma'am, found the problem on Lieutenant Keating's bird. Hydraulic line developed a stress crack, exactly like the one I replaced on your aircraft. Same age, same location, same failure mode. Adrian felt a cold certainty settle over her. This wasn't coincidence. The A-10 fleet was old, flying aircraft that had been built in the 1970s and 80s. Components failed, parts wore out, maintenance was a constant battle against entropy. But when the same specific component failed on multiple aircraft, it suggested a systemic issue. Sergeant, have you reported this up the maintenance chain? If we're seeing a pattern, the entire fleet might need inspection. Already done, ma'am. I sent a report to the maintenance officer, recommended immediate inspection of all A-10s in theater for that specific hydraulic line. They're mobilizing teams now. Rodriguez paused, his expression serious. Ma'am, you got lucky. If that line had failed during your mission, during that valley run when you were pulling maximum GS and stressing every system, you wouldn't have had the control authority to recover. I'm aware, Sergeant. Luck is a finite resource. I prefer to solve problems through maintenance rather than burning through whatever luck I have left. Yes, ma'am. We're on it. Over the next 48 hours, the maintenance crews inspected every A-10 at Bagram and discovered 3 more hydraulic lines showing early signs of stress fractures. None had failed yet, but all were replaced immediately. The issue was reported to the Air Force maintenance community globally, triggering inspections across the entire A-10 fleet. Adrian received a thank you message from the wing maintenance officer, acknowledging that Rodriguez's quick reporting had potentially prevented multiple catastrophic failures. It was a reminder that safety in military aviation was a team effort. Pilots might get the attention, but crew chiefs and maintenance personnel were the ones who kept aircraft airworthy. She wrote a commendation letter for Rodriguez, documenting his attention to detail and proactive reporting. It would go in his personnel file, supporting his next promotion board. Small recognition for someone who'd potentially saved multiple lives through competence and diligence. The missions continued. Adrian flew patrol routes, conducted training flights with less experienced pilots, participated in joint operations with ground forces. Each mission was different in its specifics but similar in its demands: preparation, execution, constant vigilance. Some days brought combat, others passed quietly. The rhythm of deployment became familiar again, the structure that made extended operations sustainable. 3 weeks after returning from leave, she received notification that her first mandatory psychological evaluation was scheduled. Dr. Williams would conduct the assessment, same protocol as before: interview, questionnaires, evaluation of decision-making and stress responses. The process felt invasive, but Adrian understood its necessity. The Air Force needed to ensure its pilots were mentally fit for combat operations. The evaluation session took place in a small office converted from a storage room. Dr. Williams had attempted to make it comfortable chairs instead of desk seating, neutral wall color, the absence of obvious recording equipment even though Adrian knew the session was being documented. Colonel Kane, thanks for making time. How have the past few weeks been? Busy, ma'am. Flying regularly, no incidents beyond routine maintenance issues. I heard about Lieutenant Keating's hydraulic failure. That must have brought back some memories from your own emergency. Adrian considered how to answer. Honesty was important. Lying to psych evaluators was both counterproductive and potentially detectable, but complete transparency had its own risks. It was a reminder that mechanical failures happen regardless of pilot skill. Keating handled it well, landed safely, no drama. How did you feel watching her deal with that emergency, knowing you'd recently experienced something similar but more severe? Confident in her ability to manage the situation, concerned about the systemic maintenance issue it revealed, satisfied that our procedures worked as designed. Williams made a note, her expression neutral. Let's talk about your decision-making during missions. Since returning from leave, have you noticed any changes in how you assess risk or make tactical choices? This was the real question, the one hiding behind the clinical language. Was she still reckless? Had the review board's restrictions modified her behavior? Did she understand why people were concerned about her judgment? I'm flying with wingmen now, which provides additional perspective on tactical decisions. I'm more conscious of following established procedures while maintaining flexibility for unusual circumstances. I still trust my training and experience, but I'm validating decisions more carefully. That sounds like a healthy evolution. Are you feeling constrained by the requirement to fly with a wingman? No, ma'am. It's actually helpful having someone else to cross-check assumptions and spot things I might miss. Solo operations have advantages, but partnered flights reduce single points of failure. They continued for another hour, Williams probing gently at Adrian's emotional state, her relationship with risk, her processing of loss and trauma. The questions were skilled, designed to reveal information without triggering defensive responses. At the end of the session, Williams closed her tablet and looked directly at Adrian. Off the record for a moment, and I mean genuinely off the record, this won't be in my report. How are you really doing? Adrian appreciated the distinction, the temporary setting aside of clinical assessment in favor of human connection. I'm functional, ma'am. I sleep adequately, eat regularly, maintain physical fitness. The flying gives me purpose. Some days are harder than others, but that's normal. Do you think about your husband? Every day. But the thoughts are less consuming than they used to be, more like background presence rather than active grief. That's healthy progression. Grief doesn't disappear, but it can transform into something more manageable. Williams paused. My official assessment will be that you're fit for continued duty with current restrictions. The wingman requirement is working well, and I don't see signs of impaired judgment or dangerous risk-taking. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you, ma'am. One more thing, though. You're aware that you can't fly combat missions forever, right? At some point you'll age out or get promoted into positions that don't involve cockpit time or simply decide you've had enough. Have you thought about what comes next? It was a question Adrian had been avoiding for years. Flying was identity, purpose, the thing that made sense when nothing else did. Imagining life after flying felt like imagining not existing. Not in detail, ma'am. I suppose I'll cross that bridge when I reach it. Fair enough. But maybe start thinking about it at least peripherally. Transitions are easier when you have time to prepare. The session ended, and Adrian walked back to her quarters through the evening heat. The psychological evaluation had been less confrontational than she'd expected, more like a conversation than an interrogation. Williams was good at her job, threading the line between clinical assessment and human empathy. That night, lying in her bunk while the base settled into its nighttime routine, Adrian thought about the question of what came next. Teaching at Nellie's was temporary 6 months, maybe a year if they extended the assignment. After that, what? She was 38, which meant maybe 7 to 10 years of flying remaining before age and rank made cockpit time impractical. The teaching assignment at Nellie's arrived 2 months later, pulling Adrian out of the deployment cycle and sending her back to the United States. She completed 12 additional combat missions in Afghanistan, all without incident, all following protocols and procedures. The review board's restrictions had become routine. She barely noticed flying with wingmen anymore. Nellie's Air Force Base sat on the edge of Las Vegas, a sprawling complex dedicated to advanced tactical training. The weapons school operated here, training the Air Force's best pilots to become even better, to develop tactics that would disseminate throughout the service. Adrian had attended weapons school herself a decade ago, a grueling 6-month course that had refined her understanding of air combat. Now she'd return as an instructor, teaching close air support tactics to a new generation of A-10 pilots. The instructor cadre welcomed her with the casual professionalism of people who'd all survived their own.